June 16, 1943, Port Moresby, New Guinea. The tropical sun hadn't yet cleared the ragged silhouette of the Owen Stanley Range when Captain J. Zeamer Jr. brought the 4 Wright Cyclone engines of his B-17E bomber rumbling to life. The sound rolled across the airfield like distant thunder, steady and certain, while the heavy scent of fuel and damp grass mingled in the morning haze. Officially, the aircraft was known as number 4126666, but to every man on the base, she was simply Old 666. She sat there at the far end of the runway, engines growling, loaded with enough fuel for a 10-hour flight, and enough ammunition to start a small war. What she didn't carry was an escort. Zeamer was about to fly more than 1,000 miles into some of the most fiercely defended skies in the Pacific, alone. He had with him 9 volunteers, men who understood exactly what volunteer meant that morning. They knew the odds of returning were somewhere between slim and none. The mission briefing had been brutally direct, the kind that leaves no room for bravado. Allied intelligence needed reconnaissance photographs of Buka and Bougainville far up in the northern Solomon Islands. Japanese forces were building airfields there, staging grounds for whatever might come next, and General MacArthur's planners needed eyes on those runways before launching Operation Cartwheel. The problem was cruelly simple. Buka sat more than 600 miles inside enemy territory, ringed by at least 400 Japanese fighters spread across a dozen airfields. Standard doctrine said such a mission demanded a fighter escort. But doctrine, that morning, had to give way to physics. No Allied fighter in the Pacific had the range to make that kind of round trip. Someone would have to go alone, slow, steady, and exposed, while the cameras did their work. The hope wasn't in avoiding the enemy. It was in surviving long enough to finish the job. 3 crews had already declined the assignment. Official records put it politely. Mission declined due to tactical concerns. But everyone on the ground knew the truth. Veteran pilots had looked at the maps, done the math, and quietly told their superiors, "That's not a mission. It's a one-way ticket." A heavy bomber flying alone at fixed speed and altitude. Its cameras needed stillness, and stillness was suicide in enemy skies. Japanese spotters could see such a plane from 50 miles away, giving them time to scramble every zero within range. There would be no cover, no clouds thick enough, no fighter wing to call on for help. And that's when someone in the operations tent said a name, almost as a half joke that turned serious the moment it was spoken: J. Zeamer. Not because he was reckless, or even because he was the best pilot on the roster, though by then many suspected he was, but because Zeamer had a reputation for taking missions no one else wanted, and somehow bringing his men home. He'd flown Old 666 on long mapping runs over the uncharted mountains of New Guinea, always a step ahead of Japanese patrols. His crew trusted him with the kind of loyalty that defied logic, faith built not on luck, but on how calmly he handled fear. And Old 666 herself wasn't just another B-17. Over months of scavenging, patching, and what mechanics half-jokingly called creative engineering, Zeamer had turned her into something entirely different, the most heavily armed bomber in the Pacific. So when headquarters offered him the Bougainville run, Zeamer didn't flinch. He studied the charts, checked fuel ratios, weighed their odds, and simply said yes. Not because he didn't grasp the danger, he did better than most, but because somewhere out there, 9 Allied air crews were already stranded in the waters around Bougainville. They'd been shot down in previous operations, hiding on scattered islands, praying someone would come for them. The photographs Zeamer's crew would bring back could show the rescue teams exactly where the enemy was, which channels were safe, which beaches could serve as pickup zones. Those photos might mean life or death for nearly 100 men. So, on that quiet June morning, Zeamer and his crew climbed aboard Old 666. The air inside the fuselage was thick with the smell of oil and sweat-polished metal. They ran through their pre-flight checks by rote, each movement deliberate, as though routine might keep fear at bay. The control tower wished them good hunting. Nobody dared to say, "See you later." When the bomber rolled forward and lifted into the pale light, banking north toward enemy skies, more than a few ground crewmen stood motionless, watching the shape shrink into the haze. Some muttered a prayer. Others simply turned away, unwilling to watch 10 men fly into what looked, from the ground, like the end. To understand why Jay Zemer was the man who would take that flight, you have to know how he ended up with old 666 in the first place. Because this isn't the usual tale of the military's best, getting the best equipment. It's the opposite. A story of a pilot no one wanted, inheriting an airplane no one trusted, and turning both into legends through pure, stubborn defiance. Zemer had graduated from MIT with an engineering degree before the war. Calm, methodical, the kind of mind that saw machinery as extensions of thought. He earned his pilot wings in 1941 and arrived in the Pacific the next year with immaculate flying skills and terrible timing. His original crew was reassigned before they ever flew a mission together, leaving him a spare part in the system, a backup pilot, used only when others fell sick or needed leave. For a man who had crossed the ocean dreaming of combat flights, it was an invisible kind of humiliation. Months passed. He flew cargo runs, delivered mail, ferried supplies, useful work, but never the real thing. And to make matters worse, Zemer had opinions. He questioned procedures that didn't make sense. He proposed aircraft modifications nobody had requested. He spent his evenings studying Japanese air tactics instead of joining the card games and poker laughter of the officer's tent. In a world built on hierarchy and habit, that made him a problem. An early 1943 personnel report summed him up in a single sterile line. Technically proficient, but shows insufficient deference to established protocols. Translated from military English, it meant he thinks he's smarter than his superiors, and nobody wants to deal with him. Then came old 666. She'd been nearly destroyed on a mission earlier that year, limped home full of holes, her tail almost torn away, one engine coughing itself to death. When she touched down at Port Moresby, the mechanics said she was salvageable, but barely. They patched what they could, then towed her to the far edge of the airfield, a kind of graveyard where crippled planes waited for parts, attention, or the quiet mercy of the scrapyard torch. Most men stopped seeing those hulks after a while, but Zemer saw possibility. He walked around the battered frame of old 666 and saw, beneath the bent metal, something worth saving. He went to his commanding officer with an offer that sounded half mad. "Let me fix her. Let me keep her. Give me a crew, and we'll stay out of everyone's way." The CO, amused and already overworked, said something like, "Sure, why not?" The kind of permission given when no one expects results. Zemer got to work. He found a bombardier, Joe Sarnowski, another man left behind by the system, a sharpshooter stuck doing desk jobs. Then came waist gunners, a navigator, a radio man, all drifters in the machine, men tired of waiting for someone to believe in them. Together they rebuilt old 666 from the inside out. But Zemer didn't rebuild her to factory standards, he rebuilt her to survive. A standard B-17E carried 13 50 caliber machine guns. Zemer added 6 more, scavenged from wrecks, jury-rigged into custom mounts, each one angled for coverage no manual had ever diagrammed. He reinforced the nose with makeshift armor plating, strictly against regulations, but regulations had never taken fire over Rabaul. He modified the bomb bay to carry ammunition instead of bombs, knowing that in photo missions they'd need bullets more than payloads. He even installed a pair of guns that could fire straight down through the fuselage, covering the blind belly where Japanese fighters loved to strike. Maintenance crews shook their heads and called him obsessed. Maybe he was. But as the engines of old 666 growled back to life under that New Guinea sun, Every bolt and every improvised gun mount spoke of one man's refusal to accept what others called impossible. And somewhere beyond the mountains, the sky was already turning silver with the first light of day. Other pilots laughed when they saw old 666 taxiing down the line, a flying porcupine they called her, bristling with guns, patched with armor, and scarred like some beast that had already survived too many hunts. But when she finally rolled back onto the active flight line in May 1943, the laughter faded. There was simply nothing else like her in the Pacific. Heavier than any other B-17, slower too because of all that extra steel and weaponry. But in a fight, she could throw more firepower than bombers twice her size. Ziemer's long months of frustration, his engineer's mind and restless need to fix what others ignored, had turned into a strange kind of advantage. By June 1943, he and his crew had flown enough mapping runs to prove themselves. Not celebrated, not famous, just professionals who got the job done, quietly, efficiently. They were misfits who'd stopped trying to fit in, and maybe that was why they worked so well together. When headquarters needed a crew for a mission with terrible odds and no promise of glory, they thought of that odd pilot with the Frankenstein bomber. If things went wrong, command reasoned, they wouldn't be losing their best. The flight to Buka took nearly 4 hours. For most of that time, the world seemed strangely peaceful. Old 666 droned north over the Solomon Sea at 25,000 feet, where the air thinned and the ocean below looked like hammered glass. They flew high enough to avoid the worst anti-aircraft fire, low enough that they didn't have to live on oxygen masks. The engines hummed with a steady rhythm, like 4 giant hearts beating in unison. Ziemer kept the throttles eased back to conserve fuel. They would need every drop for the long road home. In the navigator's station, Ruby Johnston bent over his charts, murmuring course corrections into the intercom. In the radio compartment, Forrest Dillman listened through the hiss of static, searching for any sign that Japanese radar had picked them up. Up in the nose, Bombardier Joe Sarnowski adjusted the cameras one last time, checking the exposure settings and angle of each lens. The men were tense, of course, but it was the kind of tension soldiers grow used to, the quiet, focused strain of doing something difficult that must be done exactly right. At 0900 hours, they reached the target zone. Ziemer eased the bomber down to 20,000 feet and leveled off. This was the dangerous part, the 6 longest minutes of their lives. For the photographs to be any use, old 666 had to fly straight and level, without weaving or climbing, maintaining an exact speed and altitude while the cameras clicked methodically. 6 minutes of perfect stillness. 6 minutes of exposure in hostile airspace. 3 minutes into the photo run, the calm broke. Waist gunner William Vaughn, scanning the sky through his gun sight, saw them first. A scatter of black dots rising fast from the direction of Kahili Airfield. He counted again, just to be sure, before thumbing his intercom. Switch. Fighters, 5 o'clock high. Looks like 15, maybe 20. Ziemer's voice came back almost conversational, as if they were talking in the mess tent. How long until they reach us, Ruby? Johnston ran a quick calculation. 3 minutes, maybe 4. Joe, Ziemer called forward. How much longer on the photo run? 3 minutes for full coverage, Sarnowski answered, eyes still on his instruments. That was the moment of decision. Break off now and run for home, or finish the job and face what was coming. Ziemer didn't hesitate. All guns, get ready, we're finishing the run. In the rear, the gunners chambered fresh belts, checked their sights, and steadied themselves. The black dots grew into the sharp, unmistakable silhouettes of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, the same fighters that had ruled the Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. Sleek, fast, and flown by men who had trained for years before the war began. Allied intelligence estimated there were nearly 400 Japanese fighters stationed across the northern Solomons. Today, it felt like half of them were coming for old 666. The first Zero dived at 0907, streaking down from above and behind in a textbook attack. The pilot opened fire at 400 yards, and tracer lines curved upward toward the bomber's tail like angry sparks. Tail gunner Herbert Pugh answered instantly. His twin 50s roared back, the sound filling the fuselage with a vibrating thunder that rattled teeth and instruments alike. The Zero broke off. Whether hit or just cautious, no one could tell, but 3 more were already coming in from different directions. What followed lasted 13 minutes by the clock, though to the men inside old 666, it felt like time itself had bent and stretched. Every second was both endless and gone in a flash. The Japanese pilots were no amateurs. These were veterans, some of the best in their air groups. They had developed new tactics to fight B-17s, hitting from multiple directions at once, converging from above, below, and the sides to overwhelm the bomber's defenses. Against an ordinary B-17 with a standard crew, those tactics worked beautifully, but old 666 was no ordinary bomber, and her crew was anything but standard. Every gun Zimmer had added, every modification he'd insisted on paid off now. Each firing position overlapped another, creating a cage of fire around the aircraft. Zeros diving from the rear flew into the crossfire of tail, waist, and dorsal guns. Those attacking from below met the surprise of the ventral gun Zimmer himself had designed. Frontal assaults found themselves staring into the reinforced nose, where Sarnowski's guns waited with grim precision. The bomber trembled under the force of 19 50-caliber guns, firing in rotating bursts. The air inside filled with the metallic scent of cordite, hot oil, and adrenaline. Empty shell casings clattered across the floor, bouncing off boots. The temperature climbed well past 100 degrees from the heat of the barrels. Gunners shouted bearings and warnings over the intercom, short, clipped words drowned by the roar of engines and gunfire. Zimmer flew through it all with astonishing calm. His hands never left the controls. Every motion was small, precise, just enough to throw off an attacker's aim without spoiling the photo run. He seemed to sense the rhythm of the fight, adjusting the bomber's angle like a conductor guiding an orchestra of thunder and steel. And through all of it, the cameras kept rolling. In the nose, Sarnowski changed film magazines, adjusted focus, checked exposure, as if nothing outside the plexiglass mattered. That was the mission, and he would see it done. The Zeros came in waves, relentless and fast. Each time they broke off, another took its place. Then, at 0909, the cockpit filled with a flash of white light and a deafening crack. A 20mm cannon round had punched through the windscreen, detonating inside. The blast tore through the instrument panel, shredding gauges, cutting control cables. Shards of metal whirled like angry bees. One fragment seared into Zimmer's right arm, another ripped across his leg. He felt warmth spreading through his flight suit, but his grip never loosened. The bomber was still flying. The cameras were still running. That was all that mattered. In the nose, Sarnowski had just finished changing another roll of film when a Zero came straight at them, head-on, guns blazing. A frontal attack, the deadliest angle for both sides. There was barely time to react before the fighter filled his viewfinder. Sarnowski swung his 50 forward and squeezed the trigger. His tracers stitched across the Zero's cowling, sparks leaping from the engine. The Japanese fighter shuddered, trailing smoke, but not before its burst tore through the nose. Sarnowski fell back, hit multiple times in the chest and abdomen. The pain was sharp, then distant. He knew immediately. Any medic would have known. Those were mortal wounds. For a moment, he sagged against the bulkhead, the world narrowing to sound. The distant engines, the chatter of guns, Zimmer's voice calling orders through static. He could have stopped there. No one would have blamed him. But the Zeros were still coming. His gun was still working. And so he gripped the handles again, braced himself against the navigator's table, and kept firing. His breath came in ragged bursts, each one shallower than the last. But when another Zero swept past the nose, Sarnowski tracked it cleanly, fired, and saw it fall, a trail of black smoke spiraling down to the sea below. Inside the aircraft, nobody spoke. There was only the rhythm of the engines, the mechanical pulse of the guns, and somewhere deep in the noise, the quiet courage of a man who refused to let go. Outside, the sky burned silver with sunlight and gunfire, and the horizon shimmered, as if the very air held its breath. By the time his third confirmed kill had streaked away into the horizon, Zemer's body was already screaming with exhaustion, though he somehow managed to take down one more before fatigue pressed too heavily against his limbs. In the cramped, humming belly of old 666, the waist gunners were grappling with their own desperate dance of survival. The Japanese pilots, quick to recognize the bomber's heaviest defensive fire around the rear and flanks, had adapted, diving from beneath and ahead, angles where the bomber's protective grid thinned, exposing soft spots. William Vaughn leaned out into the slipstream, buffeted by the relentless 200-mile-an-hour winds, trying to bring his gun to bear on a Zero slipping past below. The first tracer rounds whistled past him. One struck his shoulder, another grazed the side of his skull. The world spun red and dizzy, but he stayed at his post, his hands locked onto the cold steel, his eyes fixed on the approaching threat. In the tail section, Herbert Pugh had been locked in near-constant fire for 8 minutes, the barrels of his twin 50s glowing faintly cherry red in the dim compartment, each shot sending vibrations through his arms and into his chest. Ammunition dwindled, yet he continued, instinct guiding his aim. A high-side Zero arced into view. Pugh led his target just so, his rounds marching along the fighter's fuselage, climbing toward the cockpit. The plane rolled inverted, smoke curling behind it, and fell away, confirming the tail gunner's fourth kill, though counting had long ceased to matter. There were always more shadows in the sky, always another wave. Co-pilot John Britton bore the pain of shrapnel tearing into both legs, the result of a 20mm shell exploding against the armor Zemer had added behind his seat, metal that had saved him from even greater damage, though not without cost. Blood soaked into his flight suit, each movement a fresh wave of agony. He glanced at Zemer, barely conscious, and slumped forward, and felt the weight of the situation tighten around him. Should the captain pass out entirely, Britain would have to navigate the battered bomber home, the responsibility pressing down like the humid Pacific air at 25,000 feet. Dorsal turret gunner Johnny Ale had lost 2 fingers to a fragment of a 20mm shell, yet wrapped his hand in a torn sleeve and continued to fire one-handed, bracing the gun with his knee. Radio operator Forrest Dillman, normally relegated to monitoring signals, grabbed a spare machine gun, adding his fire to the relentless curtain of lead. Even Ruby Johnston, when not plotting their faltering escape, moved from gun to gun, feeding belts of ammunition, tracking enemy vectors, and calling out positions with a calm born of repeated exposure to chaos. By 09:15, 7 minutes into the engagement, and with the photographic run finally complete, Zemer spoke the words that threaded a thin line of hope through the cabin. "Photos done. We're getting out of here." He pushed the control yoke forward, dipping old 6666's nose to pick up extra speed. The bomber could never outrun Zeros, nothing could, yet each added mile per hour challenged the enemy's calculations and forced the Japanese pilots into more desperate, aggressive maneuvers. Smoke trailed from the number 3 engine, a silent banner of the punishment the plane had endured, aluminum skin peeling away in jagged flares. But the old beast continued to fight, every gun still blazing. Zemer's modifications meant there were still belts of ammunition when other bombers would have gone silent. By the end of the 13-minute onslaught, at least 5 Zeros had been confirmed destroyed, with others heavily damaged. The enemy, seasoned and pragmatic, recognized when the cost outweighed the gain and broke off, retreating toward their bases. Inside Old 666, there was no cheer, no triumph, only the ringing silence that followed the storm. The engines settled into their droning hum. The wind screamed through dozens of rents in the fuselage, and every man became painfully aware of his own injuries. The number 3 engine rattled ominously, sending vibrations that made the airframe groan and their hearts tremble. Zimmer struggled to assess his aircraft. Rudder sluggish, ailerons reluctant, trim tabs ruined. Instruments blinked erratically, gauges fractured or jammed. Airspeed was a guess, altitude questionable, hydraulic pressure vanished, the landing gear and flaps uncertain at best. The remaining 600 miles to Port Moresby stretched into a blur. Zimmer's leg bled stubbornly, consciousness threatening to drift like water, slipping through cupped hands. He shook his head violently, bit down hard, willing himself back into the present. Then Britton's voice, taut with pain but steady, broke through. "Jay, let me have her for a minute." Zimmer, pragmatic despite himself, handed over control. Britton guided the aircraft with grim determination, every input sending bolts of agony up his legs and spine. Zimmer worked quickly to tie a tourniquet around his own leg with a strip of flight jacket, crude but sufficient to slow the flow and buy precious time. In the nose, Sarnowski lay slumped, unconscious from blood loss. Johnston crawled to his side, already knowing the gravity of the situation. His training was limited to basic first aid, but he knew enough to recognize mortal wounds. He wrapped Sarnowski in every available blanket, every coat, trying to stave off shock, to preserve a thread of warmth and life until proper care could be reached. Through the damaged radio, Forrest Dillman managed a fragmented message to Port Moresby. Mission completed. En route home, multiple casualties, request ambulances. Static cut the edges of every word, but acknowledgement was faintly discernible. Whether rescue crews would be ready remained uncertain, hanging like a shadow over the crew. Standard procedure for receiving a rapportentu. Aircraft this battered would be to assume it wouldn't make it back. Dead reckoning was now Ruby Johnston's grim calculus, done with shaking hands and a body battered by his own shoulder wound. Every correction, every calculation carried the weight of lives teetering on the edge. The Pacific spread below them, calm and indifferent, a mirror of sky and sea that had seen countless storms before. And inside, Old 666, 10 men, bloodied and broken, guided her stubbornly toward home. The world narrowed to instruments, intercoms, and the faint, steady hum of engines that refused to die. The bomber shuddered, a wounded leviathan cutting through the dawn haze, and the horizon held its breath. With instruments badly damaged, winds shifting unpredictably, and no reliable way to measure their ground speed, Johnston navigated almost entirely by instinct, intuition, and a quiet prayer whispered under his breath. He called out a heading of 185 degrees to Britton, instructing him to hold that course for the next hour. If Johnston's calculations held true, they would drift southward over the Solomon Sea, safely away from Japanese-occupied territory. If he misjudged, the bomber could glide unknowingly toward another hostile airfield, where a single misstep would undo all their efforts. Time stretched in the cabin, punctuated only by the distant groan of Old 666's engines and the soft, rhythmic groan of her frame. After about 20 minutes, Zimmer regained consciousness and took the controls back from Britton, who didn't argue, barely clinging to consciousness himself. The two settled into a tenuous rhythm, trading the yoke every 15 to 20 minutes, each man steering the battered bomber while the other caught fleeting rest. It was not how manuals suggested flying a multi-engine bomber, but nothing about this flight resembled the ordinary. At 10:30 hours, the number 3 engine surrendered completely, grinding and shrieking like a wounded animal. Zimmer feathered the propeller and cut the fuel, leaving the aircraft to glide on 3 engines, barely enough to keep her aloft. Their altitude bled away from 25,000 feet to 20,000, then 15,000. Each lost 1,000 feet carried the invisible weight of risk, the probability of encountering Japanese patrols climbing with every drop. Yet physics was indifferent to danger. By 11:30, they crossed what Johnston estimated as the midpoint of their journey, 300 miles behind, 300 miles ahead, a narrow thread of distance suspended over a vast expanse of sea. They had done all they could for themselves medically. Crude bandages, torn jackets turned into tourniquets. Every one of them was still alive, a quiet, fragile victory in itself. But survival for the next 3 hours would demand that old 666 hold together against every expectation, her battered engines humming stubbornly, her fuselage shaking, leaking hydraulic fluid and fuel, trembling with each flex of the damaged control surfaces. Trust was all that kept them aloft. The crew trusted Zemer, and he trusted the bomber he had rebuilt with his own hands, a Frankensteinian aircraft that refused to die. Somewhere over the glinting blue of the Solomon Sea, bleeding, broken, and exhausted, they kept flying towards home. The significance of their mission was not lost on them. These reconnaissance photographs, safely stored in the nose compartment beneath Sarnowski's protecting body, contained intelligence that could save lives and alter the unfolding strategic picture of the Pacific Theater. Operation Cartwheel, General MacArthur's carefully orchestrated plan to neutralize the Japanese base at Rabaul without direct assault, relied on precision, capturing or isolating airfields, severing supply lines, and methodically rendering the base irrelevant. Yet executing such a strategy demanded more than theory. It required current high-resolution aerial photographs. Bu'a and Bougainville, the islands Zemer had flown over, were critical junctions along the supply route between Rabaul and the southern Solomon positions. Intelligence hinted at Japanese expansion there, but guesses and outdated reports could not suffice. MacArthur's planners needed precise coordinates, runway lengths, anti-aircraft placements, fuel depots, and an array of other details only aerial photography could provide. Previous attempts had faltered, either driven off by intercepting fighters or unable to get close enough to capture meaningful images. A more immediate concern pressed upon their minds. 9 Allied bomber crews, nearly 90 men, stranded in the waters or hiding on islands around Bougainville. They had been shot down over the preceding 3 weeks, scattered like driftwood across the Pacific. Some clung to uninhabited islands, awaiting rescue. Others relied on locals to shield them from Japanese patrols, hidden in plain sight on occupied territory. Submarines and Catalina-flying boats could attempt extractions, but only if informed precisely which routes were safe, which islands were approachable, which coastal paths remained lightly watched. The photographs aboard Old 666 held the answers. From their high vantage, the images would reveal patrol patterns, coastal gun positions, monitored beaches versus isolated inlets, and potential pickup points for rescue craft. Analysts at Port Moresby would begin developing the film immediately upon the bomber's return. Within hours, intelligence would transform into action. Within days, submarines could risk approaches previously deemed too hazardous. The broader strategic value rippled outward. The images charted Japanese progress on new airfields, informing planners whether the timeline of Operation Cartwheel needed acceleration. They revealed ammunition depots, headquarters buildings, and other priority targets for future strikes, shaping the orchestration of the campaign across the Solomons. There was also the intangible yet potent morale factor. Air crews throughout the ESNT Pacific knew about the downed men awaiting rescue. To see their comrades' extraction attempted, despite the risks, sent a clear message: no one was abandoned. In theaters where missions carried 30 to 40% casualty rates, such knowledge allowed pilots to climb into their aircraft day after day, a fragile courage reinforced by trust in their service. The photographs from June 16, 1943, would eventually be cataloged as Intelligence Report 447B, portions informing naval operations in the new Georgia invasion in July, others shaping the Marine landing at Bougainville in November, and still more guiding Air Force bombing plans into 1944. Some images remained classified for decades, a testament to the techniques and precision of Allied reconnaissance. But on that day, with the plane groaning and the Pacific stretching below like a mirror of infinite blue, Ziemer and his crew understood only this. The film magazines in the nose contained something worth every risk, every beat of agony, every whispered prayer. They did not know how many operations would hinge on these photographs, nor that their work would save 87 of the 90 stranded men. They knew only that others depended on them to complete the mission and return home. That knowledge, simple, unwavering, was enough. When old 666 finally staggered back over the airfield at Port Moresby at 14:10 hours, nearly 5 hours after takeoff, the dawn that had welcomed them now folded into the warm glow of late afternoon. The bomber settled onto the tarmac with a groan, wings heavy, engines tired but still alive, and the Pacific sunlight catching on dented metal, reflecting the weary determination of 10 men who had flown not for glory, but for the lives of their comrades and the fragile thread of strategy stretching across the Solomons. Ground crews watching from the tarmac saw the battered bomber approaching and knew instantly that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Smoke trailed from multiple points along the fuselage, curling in ghostly tendrils against the afternoon sky, and the aircraft lumbered along at barely 8,000 feet, far below its usual cruising altitude of 15,000. Its approach was jagged, uneven, the kind of flight pattern that whispered of severe control issues or an incapacitated pilot, and the tower immediately cleared all other traffic while emergency vehicles surged into position along the runway. Ambulances, fire trucks, and crash crews braced themselves, engines idling and hoses ready, anticipating the worst. Ziemer and Britton wrestled with the hand crank to lower the landing gear, for the hydraulic system was entirely dead. The process took nearly 10 excruciating minutes, every movement a testament to grit and sheer will, each man gritting his teeth against the throb of fresh and old wounds. When the wheels finally locked into place, there was no certainty, only the hope that the mechanical indicators hadn't betrayed them. The flaps refused to cooperate, frozen in partial deployment, forcing a landing speed dangerously above normal. Ziemer brought the bomber in fast, touching down at nearly 140 miles per hour, far beyond the usual 90, and old 666 bounced violently, her massive frame protesting against the tarmac, before finally settling and rolling the full length of the runway under Ziemer's patient, taut control. Medics swarmed immediately, moving before the propellers had ceased their churning. They found 10 wounded men, every single one battered in some way. Ziemer and Britton were physically removed from the cockpit, both of them unconscious as the rush of relief collided with the exhaustion of survival. The waist gunners struggled to walk, legs trembling beneath bandages and makeshift tourniquets. The tail gunner bore powder burns across his face from the relentless firing in the confined rear compartment. In the nose, Joe Sarnowski lay slumped over his gun, unmoving, the long vigil over the Solomon Sea having claimed him somewhere around noon. Yet his body had shielded the cameras and ensured the mission was completed. The film was immediately rushed to intelligence officers, who worked through the night of June 16th into June 17th. Their analysis revealed extraordinary quality, crisp, precise images capturing every detail Allied planners needed. Individual aircraft could be counted on Kahili Airfield, new revetments and taxiways tracked in real time, coastal gun positions mapped along with firing arcs, Japanese patrol boat anchorages marked for extraction planning. The reports extended over 200 pages, meticulously cross-referenced and annotated, disseminated to multiple commands. Within 48 hours, the first rescue operation was underway. A Navy submarine picked up 6 downed airmen from an island shown in the photographs to be free of enemy forces, and over the following 3 weeks, coordinated operations recovered 87 of the 90 stranded men. 3 had already perished or been captured, but the rest returned home, their survival a direct result of the bravery and precision of the old 666 crew. The news of the daring mission spread quickly through the Pacific theater. Air crews whispered about the bomber that had mapped enemy positions under fire and made rescues possible, and recommendations for medals followed almost immediately. Zimmer's commanding officer, expecting to have lost the crew entirely, submitted the initial citations on June 18th, while pilots were still undergoing surgery. By July, the awards were finalized. Captain J. Zimmer Jr. received the Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry, and Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnosky was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. Such dual recognition for a single crew was extraordinarily rare, occurring only a handful of times in American military history. The remaining crew, co-pilot John Britton, navigator Ruby Johnston, bombardier George Kendrick, engineer Johnny Ale, radio operator Forrest, Dillman and gunners Herbert Pugh, William Vaughn, and Bud Thew, each received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. Every member of Old 666 was recognized with one of the top 2 awards for a single mission, a testament to both the unprecedented nature of the operation and the indispensable contributions of each man. Zimmer spent 3 months recovering from wounds that had required multiple surgeries, initially facing the possibility he would never fly again. Yet he defied expectations, returning to limited flight duty by late 1943, though never returning to combat. Britain recovered fully, resuming combat missions through the end of the war, while most of the gunners returned to their squadrons, enduring the attrition of a brutal campaign. Old Essington 66 herself returned to the air, her battered frame repaired over weeks by meticulous ground crews, control cables replaced, structural members patched, the entire nose section rebuilt. She flew reconnaissance missions for another year, surviving more damage and accumulating more combat hours than almost any other B-17 in the Pacific Theater, before finally being retired and scrapped in late 1944. The story of Old 666 did not end in hospital beds or the awarding of medals. What Zimmer and his crew accomplished on June 16, 1943, reshaped the Army Air Force's approach to reconnaissance, aircraft modification, and the integration of individual initiative into operational effectiveness. The lessons from that single, harrowing flight rippled through doctrine for years, influencing bomber design, crew training, and mission planning. The immediate tactical impact was profound. Before Old 666, deep reconnaissance missions were considered so perilous that crews could refuse them without formal penalty. The informal policy relied on volunteers, understanding that coercion would destroy morale and operational efficiency. Zimmer demonstrated that with the right modifications, disciplined crew training, and tactical foresight, even heavily defended targets could be successfully photographed. Within weeks, 5th Air Force Headquarters issued new guidelines recommending reinforced defensive armament for reconnaissance aircraft, codifying the modifications Zimmer had engineered. His enhancements went beyond mere guns. Armor plating was reinforced, ammunition storage repositioned for optimal weight distribution, and interlocking fields of fire established to ensure that every potential angle of attack was covered. These were systematic, deliberate changes, a rethinking of bomber configuration for reconnaissance as opposed to standard bombing runs. Boeing engineers examined photographs of Old 666's modifications, incorporating elements of Zimmer's design into later B-17 variants and into the enhanced defensive systems of B-24 Liberators. The principle that reconnaissance aircraft needed to fight their way out, rather than simply flee, became embedded in doctrine. Equally significant was the human element. Analysts studied how a crew composed largely of men underestimated or sidelined elsewhere could outperform more celebrated units under the most extreme pressure? The answer lay in Zimmer's leadership, the careful building of a team whose cohesion, trust, and shared understanding of purpose allowed them to function as a single, synchronized unit when the stakes were highest. Every modification, every decision, every quiet command had been calibrated for effectiveness, a combination of human resilience, ingenuity, and the stubborn determination of a crew unwilling to fail when others depended upon them. The echoes of that flight, a mixture of smoke, metal, and quiet courage, lingered long after the engines stilled, shaping the tactics, training, and hearts of men who would follow in their wake. The tarmac remained silent as the last echoes of the landing settled into the afternoon, the sun catching on rivets and scraped metal, a quiet testament to the endurance of a bomber and her crew, and to the unspoken promise that in war, every photograph, every detail, every life saved mattered. Jay Zimmer didn't choose the most decorated gunners or the pilots with the highest efficiency ratings. He selected men who were competent, yes, but more importantly, men who carried a quiet hunger to prove themselves, who trusted one another completely, and who had flown together so often that coordination and communication became almost instinctive. They had logged dozens of mapping and reconnaissance missions before tackling the skies over Bua, developing an unspoken rhythm that many more prestigious crews sometimes lacked. That cohesion, that ability to anticipate each other's actions in the air, rippled through the Army Air Forces long after the war. Commanders began to recognize that constantly rotating personnel to fill gaps or replace losses often disrupted more than it helped. Instead, keeping a successful crew intact became a deliberate policy, an acknowledgement that unit cohesion was more than morale. It was a force multiplier, a secret weapon in its own right. The men of old 6666 knew each other's voices, could sense when someone was in trouble before a word was spoken, and trusted that every individual would fulfill their duty, even under circumstances that seemed impossibly dire. That trust wasn't born overnight. It had been forged over months of shared flights, long hours of navigation over hostile territory, and repeated testing under the indifferent sky. It couldn't be manufactured by simply assigning skilled individuals to a crew roster. It had to be lived. The Bua mission became a definitive case study in leadership under extreme stress. Zimmer's decision-making, pressing on with the photo run while under constant attack, remaining conscious despite severe wounds, trading control of the bomber with Britain when his body faltered, illustrated a quiet, measured form of courage. Training. Schools would later use these examples not to mythologize endurance, but to demonstrate that leadership often means making the best possible choices when every option is painful or dangerous. Zimmer didn't overcome 17 Japanese fighters because of superior dogfighting skill. He overcame them by refusing to allow failure, by trusting his crew implicitly, and by managing the mission with a steadiness that spread through every station on the aircraft. For the families of the 87 rescued airmen, the significance of that day carried a far more intimate weight. Many of those men went on to finish their tours, returning home to lives that would not have existed without the photographs taken by old 6666. Children were born who otherwise wouldn't have been. Businesses were founded, families were sustained, communities enriched, small, almost invisible ripples in a vast ocean of history. Some of those airmen remained close to Zimmer's crew for the rest of their lives, their bonds forged not in comfort, but in the shared intensity of survival. A few even named their sons after Joe Sarnowski, the young lieutenant who had sacrificed his life to protect the cameras and complete the mission. The mathematics of sacrifice and preservation never balances neatly, but those involved understood with crystalline clarity the weight of what had been given and the lives that had been preserved because of it. Jay Zimmer himself lived until 2007, passing at the age of 88. He rarely spoke of the mission publicly, and when journalists sought his reflections on the Medal of Honor, he quietly deflected praise to his crew, insisting always that they had acted together. In later years, he expressed a sentiment that distilled the essence of why ordinary men accomplished extraordinary things. We just did what needed doing. Other people were depending on those photographs, and we had the aircraft and the crew to get them. It wasn't about heroism. It was about not letting people down. That ethos, the refusal to abandon a mission, the acknowledgement of responsibility toward others, became the enduring legacy of old 6666. The aircraft itself was dismantled in 1944, salvaged for metal to build other planes, leaving no physical trace, no monument, no relic. No marker now indicates where old 666 rested on the tarmac at Port Moresby, yet the photographs from June 16, 1943, remain preserved in the National Archives, climate-controlled and meticulously labeled. Anyone can request them, can trace the same coastlines, count the same aircraft, see the world as the crew saw it 80 years ago. These images are now silent, historical documents, yet they carry the invisible echo of men who bled to capture them, who died protecting them, and whose courage ensured that others would live. The whispers of propellers, the hum of high-altitude wind, the quiet determination of a crew long gone, all remain frozen in silver emulsion and in the stories. Passed from one generation to the next, the heartbeat of old 666 still lingers in the air,